All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How you guys doing? All right, there you go. My name is Bob Coughlin. I'm President and CEO of MassBio. Welcome to our afternoon Fireside Chat. We might want to put like a fireplace or something up there so it's a legitimate fireside chat. But we're real excited about this conversation that's about to happen, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about the cost of drugs. Has anybody heard about that in the press as of late? People tend to talk about drugs. They're expensive. They cost a lot of money. How is this going to be sustainable? You can't go anywhere without reading about it or hearing about it from either people that are running for office or people in the press. So now we're going to have the conversation. Why are we going to have the conversation? Because it needs to be had. We think back to 2015. David Meeker, the CEO of Sanofi Genzyme, sat down with Rob Weisman from the Boston Globe. They had a conversation about the cost of drugs in 2015. It got a lot of attention. We asked them if they'd be willing to come back and have the discussion again in a time when it's even more important to have these types of discussions so that people can be educated. I want to thank Rob Weisman, a reporter from the Boston Globe. Ladies and gentlemen, when he writes stories, he takes the time to learn the facts. In my opinion, he's one of the most well-informed, intelligent journalists that we deal with. So I want to have a round of applause for a reporter. I don't think I've ever done that in my life. I must be getting old. And David Meeker, we want to thank you. David is the CEO of Sanofi Genzyme. He's been with the company for a long time. He's an amazing human being, ladies and gentlemen. He's such a compassionate person. And he's an MD. He cares about sick people. He cares about patients. I've had the pleasure of knowing David for many, many years, and we're so lucky to have him as a leader, not only for the industry, but a leader in Massachusetts as well. And we truly want to thank you, David, for agreeing to sit in the hot seat next to the journalist from the Boston Globe, live in front of all of us, so we can watch how this is going to happen. We're excited to hear the conversation. Rob, why don't I pass it over to you?
Thanks, Bob. Can you all hear me? Terrific. Well, I was, as Bob mentioned, I was delighted to be able to talk with David at the Broad Institute last summer. I was actually amazed that they would even let me in. I didn't think I have a high enough IQ to get into that building. And I'm also amazed that David agreed to do this again. So thank you. And since the last time we talked about drug prices last summer. There was a lot of interest. We weren't competing with the New Jersey delegation or the water infused with cucumber tastes at the pavilions. But since then, there's been a number of developments on the drug front. David Ceccarelli sort of emerged as the biotech bad boy. You've had presidential candidates, Bernie and Hillary and Donald are sort of using the drug industry as a punching bag. And we even have our AG in Massachusetts threatening to sue the one biotech that's not located here, Gilead. So I guess I'll start by asking you, David, are you drug executives, biopharma executives, feeling a little beaten up on now?
So thanks, Rob. I was going to just start off by thanking Bob. Do we lose Bob? Where is Bob? He's right in the front row there. Both Rob and I were a little apprehensive about having a session again in the middle of Main Thoroughfare, but thanks to Bob getting it set up, I think it can actually work. So to Rob's question, are we feeling a little beat up? I think there's obviously a tremendous focus on the price of drugs, and that's not wrong. I mean, we should have that discussion in terms of the price of drugs. Nothing is more important to the individual than health care. The price of the medications is an important part of that health care equation, and so, like I said, it's an important part of the dialogue. I think what is challenging for me and many people in my position is the dialogue's a bit incomplete. And what I find is it's often uninformed. So I will take the position that there's no question that some drugs are priced too high. and I think we'd find a lot of support for that. I think what we would not agree on is which drugs. The drugs I might think are priced too high aren't necessarily the drugs you might think are priced too high, and I think that gets at one of the parts of this equation which is difficult. The second part is that our healthcare system as a whole costs a lot of money. And when we take one small part of that healthcare system and focus down on that as the sole issue, it distorts the equation. And for me, drugs, the big challenge for drugs is, are we the problem or are we the solution? Because at the end of the day, the cost of disease, the cost of long-term disability for society is enormous. And is it going to be fixed by more hospitals? If you were to just take our healthcare dollar today, and I'll give you some of the familiar numbers, and we can debate whether those are meaningful or not, but if we spend 14% of our healthcare dollar on drugs, and we spend 30% of our healthcare dollar on hospitals, and if we think about the return on a hospital, if I add a hospital bed, I have to keep it full. That's how, if I'm running a hospital, my job is to keep those beds full. Now, a full hospital bed is not a hotel. That's somebody I've defined as sick. And therefore, I'm going to spend money on that individual in that bed trying to analyze their illness and the like. And so the cost of that hospitalization goes up. We spend 3 times what the OECD average is on our hospitals. Now, we spend more on our drugs as well, but the ratio is less. So yes, we're beat up on, but I think there's a fuller conversation. So I welcome the beating as long as we can have that bigger conversation.
Right. And I guess the conversation has begun to emerge. I think obviously this is one component of the overall healthcare spending, which is becoming a big drag on the economy, making it difficult for families and businesses to spend money on other things. So obviously we'll get back to that as well. I'd like to bring the conversation to Genzyme, which as many of you may know, was a leader in the development of orphan drugs to treat rare diseases. And these are disease-modifying drugs to treat enzyme deficiencies like Gaucher and Fabry disease, which previously there were no real treatments for. They treat small numbers of people, and they're very expensive. And I think when Genzyme pioneered this model, it worked. No one payer was overly burdened with it. Now, in the era of precision medicines, we're getting into a time where there's a lot more drugs to treat smaller populations. So I guess my question would be, can this model be sustained going forward, or because of the aggregate, the cost of this money, will the model have to change?
Yeah, and so this is a common question. I think I'm going to argue that the rare disease example is a powerful example of success. So if you go to the unmet need there, just to define it, so there's 7,000 orphan diseases, 1 in 10 Americans, 30 million Americans. This is not a small problem as orphan diseases are defined. Now, what happens in the orphan disease space is that everything gets bundled together. The definition of an orphan disease is if you have fewer than 200,000 affected individuals in the United States. The diseases we treat that Rob was talking about, these rare genetic diseases, we're talking about a few thousand patients. And the pricing structure is such that the rarer the element, the rarer the disease, the higher the price, meaning the work that you have to do to develop that disease, the treatment for that disease is about the same, even though it's rare, and therefore you're spreading the costs over a smaller number. So the pricing at the few thousand is very different than the pricing at the 100 to 200,000. So that's number one. Number two, is it a good thing that you have these high-priced drugs? So the Orphan Disease Act in 1983, which is a law that was put in place to give incentives to companies to do research in this area, because the belief was these diseases were so rare that there was no market. No company would want to invest. So the orphan disease, very important law, But I would argue the transformation occurred when a business model was established. The moment these drugs, and Gaucher disease, Henry Tamir, the original CEO for Genzyme, priced the therapy for this rare disease, Gaucher disease, at $300,000 to $400,000 a year per patient, sort of an unheard level. Now the reality is, for that individual patient, extremely high. For society and for the healthcare system, extremely small, because the number of patients was so few. The result is, prior to that time and that orphan disease legislation, there was only 38 treatments for a rare disease. Since then, there's more than 500. Now, if that model goes away, the rare disease community will not be saved by the legislation. And remarkably, in today's debate, where there's such a focus on high prices, the rare disease price point is not the center of that discussion. When I talk to payers, there's an understanding, a greater understanding, in fact, about that model and the importance of that model and how it works. Now, your question was, suppose all 7,000, get approved, and my answer would be, God, what a great problem to have. I mean, these aren't a rash. These are life-threatening diseases. So, and I'll close this part, which is to say, if we look at our healthcare dollar, how much money is in waste and fraud, how much is on hospitalizations, how much on drugs, as a society, where do we want to put it? And I might argue, if we can transform these diseases, that's a pretty good spend.
So, as you pointed out, one of the drugs that sort of sparked these discussions on drug prices was Gilead's Sovaldi, and they since have come out with a treatment called Harvoni. And these are hepatitis C drugs that virtually cure the vast majority of the patients. So that would save a lot of money for the healthcare system over the long haul. However, they cost $1,000 per pill. I think $84,000 for, at least for Sovaldi, for a 12-week course of treatment, and they've been bankrupting a lot of the Medicaid managed care plans. So in the short term, it seems like it's causing a lot of disruptions among the payer networks. I guess I would ask, how do you compare, because these are drugs that treat millions of people as opposed to thousands. But I mean, how do you compare value? How do you set value how do you compare like a cancer drug that treats 1 million people or a vaccine that treats 1 million people to a rare disease drug? I mean, is there any kind of intrinsic value, or is it just sort of driven by the market and the ability to develop drugs for these rare conditions?
So the Sovaldi example, of course, we could talk about, I think, for a few hours here, and it's such a great example. At $84,000 per patient, it's cost effective. Now, as Rob said, the problem is the 3 million people in the United States who have hepatitis C, if they all put up their hand and ask for it in the first year, we're going to spend $200 to $250 billion to treat all those patients. And we're going to increase by 50% to 75% our total drug spend. And of course, the system can't absorb that. The reality is, over time, however, we can eliminate hepatitis C, and over time, the value to society is more than worth it. And yesterday, I was in a conversation with listening to a debate with a health economist, and the health economist's argument was the societal benefit of Sovaldi is $1.2 trillion over time. And the cost to treat all these people in the United States is, $250 billion. And so, the idea that 20% goes to the innovator and the rest goes to society doesn't seem so bad. The problem is, we didn't get the Sovaldi equation right. What happened with Sovaldi is it did come as a surprise. We could have prepared better. We could have had more, discussions. We could have thought about what are the limitations in our system today that preclude more innovative approaches to reimbursement. that limit the ability of a innovator manufacturer to talk to the payer and discuss some innovative payments. So I think we need to study the Sovaldi equation. One last thing on it, of the many different aspects, it priced at $84,000. Within 6 months, the competitor was in the market and the price was discounted publicly, this is known, by 40 to 50%. And so the market forces worked. And I think one of the things we don't give enough credit for is that market forces work. The lead time that you have as an innovator in a new class of medicine used to be 4 to 5 years. That number has now dropped to where it's 2.7. This isn't talking about a generic. This is talking about another innovative drug in your same class, like the Sovaldi class, hepatitis C, like the PCSK9 drugs, where different molecules, both did full development, they were put head to head, and they drove the price down. So market forces are in play, and that fact is lost in this conversation.
So I'm looking around at Australia and Austria and all these other countries here, and I'm sure that they wouldn't claim to develop or discover anywhere near as many drugs as come out of the U.S. or out of Massachusetts even. But their drugs are a lot cheaper in those countries. The U.S. has got the highest price of drugs in the world. Why is that, David? And why do the drugs come out of the U.S. but cost more here than they do everywhere else?
So they do cost more here, and the innovation happens here. And I'm going to argue we want the innovation to happen here. We are not investing in the UK. We're a French company, and we are not investing in France at the same level we are investing in the United States. It's a fair question, obviously, to ask, as a global community, how do we want to distribute costs? I think the reality is that we are not going to get agreement on that. And I think my own personal bias as a United States citizen is I'm willing to pay more for my health care here. Remember, I pay more for everything. I pay more for my hospitals. I pay more for my doctors. I pay more for my MRI. I pay more for my drugs. But this is a healthcare system where the quality of care that I can get, and it's not perfect, let's face it, but the quality of care that I get is competitive with certainly most systems around the world. I'll give you one other example. I'm looking at the Australia sign. As an innovator, Australia has been willing to take a position that says we will deny access to some of these new drugs to our community, to our citizens. And that's how you keep the price of drugs down. That's a tough discussion, and we've been in the situation of having to provide drug-free in Australia when the system is saying we're not willing to pay. That's not a sustainable outcome, and that's not where we want to be. So this is a fair question. It's a tough question, and I think it's one that deserves a good debate. But I personally think that we benefit by being the innovators. We want to be the innovators, and it means we pay a premium.
So when you negotiate prices in the U.S., you're dealing primarily with private payers, commercial insurers, but also with Medicare, Medicaid, other government agencies. When you're dealing with negotiating prices in Europe or elsewhere in the world, you're dealing with the government. What's the difference? I mean, obviously there's a lot more governments around, but I'm sure each one is different. But is there a general difference in terms of how those negotiations go?
Yes and no. I think the single payer system in some cases has a more holistic view, and I think that world's evolving. They've become much more just focused on the price, but you have the opportunity for a more holistic view of how do we, in partnership, solve the problem we have together. You have a sick patient, we have a potential treatment. It's costing your society a certain amount, so that. Increasingly, it's become more of a negotiation around price. You have to remember, so United Healthcare covers 60 million lives. That's the size of France. So our payers, have a negotiating power which is not different, certainly and as consolidation happens, then many of the countries that we deal with around the world. So it's not the United States of Europe, but it's the many countries of Europe, which isn't necessarily different than the many payers of the United States. So this is the world we live in, and I'll go back to again and saying market forces work. This is where what doesn't work, and this is what's challenging in Europe, is when you start to legislate pricing. I personally believe, industry said it, but I am a big believer, when you start to legislate pricing, put caps on pricing, the drive to innovate will go away. This is an incredibly high-risk industry. And the VC dollars, the environment here in the U.S., part of the reason it works is that VC, venture capital dollars, private dollars, public markets are willing to put money at risk because they believe in this and they believe in the potential of a return. Once that is eliminated, we are not going to get the cure from Alzheimer's on the NIH budget. That's not happening.
So we don't have NICE here, the British pricing agency, but we're starting to see these organizations cropping up like ICER, which is a Boston-based nonprofit that's trying to come up with formulas for pay for performance, or I guess what they call value-based pricing. You're also seeing some of the doctors groups, medical groups like ASCO, and I think the Heart Association now is involved, and Memorial Sloan Kettering, the hospital, and others are trying to determine, is there a formula for determining a fair price for drugs? I know that these efforts are in their infancy. They seem to be getting a lot of attention. They seem to be used by insurance companies in negotiations as ammunition. What do you see as the impact of these? Are these going to take root, or at some point will they coalesce into a larger movement?
No, I think the impact is, of course, potentially very significant, and it's very significant because we all want a simple answer. We want somebody to tell us the answer. What is the value? Give me a number. And my concern about ICER and other health technology assessment vehicles, and this is an academic field. I mean, it's a quite sophisticated field. Analyzing value. There's many different components that go into it, and of course there's a subject, your view of value and my view of value may not be, the same, of course. But the field itself has different components, and for example, a key component is understanding what it costs to manage that disease without your new intervention. What is the natural history? And having really good data on the natural history and the costs associated with that care is key to getting the value equation right. How do you know how much cost you're saving if you don't know what you were spending before? And so this is a field which is in its infancy, and on any given disease state, I can tell you the data is highly, highly variable. But this is an important exercise, and getting to a better understanding of value is critical. And so we need to continue to evolve this field, but we need to understand the limitations of the tool. We can't jump to the answer without understanding the weaknesses and the strengths that are part of that tool. So that's where we are. The ICER equation has this value assessment part. It has another part which I find actually quite worrisome, which is they're taking the value assessment and then they're combining it with a budget impact assessment and putting the two together and saying this is what a drug should cost. Those to me are two very different. Let's first decide on what we think the value is, then let's have a separate conversation about whether we can afford it. Let's not just leap and let one organization come down and say, here's the value and here's what we can afford and therefore that's the number. And that short circuits this discussion, and as patients and consumers of healthcare, we should not let that discussion get short-circuited, or we'll be in a healthcare system none of us like when somebody we love gets sick.
So one of the components of this value-based pricing is pay for performance. So that's one of the concepts. And I guess the idea is that rather than pay a set price for a drug, a mass market drug, as we move into an era of personalized medicines, targeting specific genetic mutations, pay for the drug when it works. The price should be tied to the outcome. What do you think of that concept?
No, it's great. I mean, this is the ideal state, right? And there are examples where that is possible. So, for example, these new anti-PCSK9 drugs, which lower LDL cholesterol. Now, that's a hard output, right? You can measure. It's a lab test. So you can get a number, and you can very accurately and relatively efficiently determine whether you got the desired outcome. And you could create a system that said, I'll pay you for the patients that get that outcome, and I won't pay you to those, or I'll pay you for in a graded way. Now, a couple problems. There are relatively few disease states that have that very clean outcome. Our system is not set up very well to capture and monitor outcomes so that we can go back and say, okay, we agreed on this, so now how do we add up who responded and who didn't so I know how much to pay? So there's a big gap between the ideal state and what's possible. And there's a last hurdle, which is to say, again, the way the regulations, the legislation works, the rules around pricing, best price, for example, in the United States, your average selling price, the law that says you have to give your best price to the Medicaid, the government, these parts of our healthcare system that by law required, these graded schemes could mean that in the patient who didn't get the outcome, you gave a very low price. But that suddenly becomes your lowest price for that whole other part of the community. So again, until the rules change, until the systems get better at being able to capture and define outcomes, we're going to have a tough time putting very many of these agreements in place.
Now, we're also maybe entering an era of gene therapies, where you have companies like Spark and Bluebird are coming up with these treatments that, if they succeed, could potentially cure someone with a rare disease. You take one pill or one treatment, I guess one procedure once, and you're cured. But they also treat small numbers of people, a lot of the early diseases. So that would have to command a very high price. How do you pay for a once treatment? Is there a new model that could cover that type of contingency, like an annuity, or is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah, so we're interested in gene therapy as well, and I'd say many or most people in the industry are thinking about this. So I'm actually more confident that we're going to figure that model out. I do think it's easier to think about paying over time. Now, in a sense, that's outcome-based, as long as you don't need another treatment. So the biggest pushback for that is, well, patients don't stay in their health insurance plans for long enough for the insurance plan to see the benefit of that upfront cost. I think, so some of the arguments I've heard which resonate are, people stay in their plans longer than you think. Patients with chronic diseases stay in their plans longer than you think. I think we have more of a window to work with here in terms of, an annuity, a mortgage-based kind of structure that says you can pay over time. But yeah, these are coming, and it's good news. And it's going to force us to figure it out. I would say it's quite clear the system, like many things, may not figure it out until the gun's literally at its head and says, okay, it's here today, I have to solve it now. We can kick that can down the road a little longer, but not much longer.
Great. Well, I want to open it up for questions in a bit, but first I wanted to ask you a little bit about the political clamor. I mean, obviously, it's not surprising that presidential candidates would raise these issues, but you're also seeing in various states around the country, including Massachusetts, bills that would try to contain drug costs by, among other things, requiring transparency, requiring the drug companies to divulge their marketing costs, their research, manufacturing costs, how much they charge in other countries, et cetera. There's a bill in the Massachusetts legislature. I think I heard Bob Coughlin testify against it. But what do you think about these types of efforts? Is this doable? Would this help the situation?
Yeah, I think, so this is maybe back a little bit in the category of being beaten up on. I'm all, it's hard to be against transparency, right? I mean, what's wrong with that? I think the challenge with transparency is not the information that you put on the table, it's the ability of people to understand the information you put it on the table and have it in the right context. So that's the one big fear. When you take a big company like Sanofi that I'm in, we get maybe one or two new drugs out a year. We spend $5 billion on our R&D budget. Sorting out, which part of those costs went to the drug that got approved, and of course, the many drugs that fail. There was actually just the Bio organization just did a survey of 1,000 companies, and all the drugs that they had going back through approval in the recent past. A drug in phase 1 clinical trials has a 9% chance of getting approved. If you're a cancer drug, it's 5%. So these are the parts of the equation that, is the system just going to leap to a number and say, oh, well, you said it costs $100, therefore your price must be this, without the ability to understand this larger, because again, we'll do damage. And then the other part of this is 9 out of 10 biotech companies make no profit. They're not profitable. They have no money. They're spending money, but they're not making any money. And so these are burdens which just, they add significantly to all of the hurdles that is required to get a drug to a patient. It's tough. So I think it's misguided, to be honest with you. I think it's not where we should go. Let's have the bigger conversation about our healthcare dollar. Let's talk about waste in the system. There's 400 billion of waste in our 2 trillion plus, 2.7 trillion plus that we spend. That's equal to the whole healthcare budget.
There's also a ballot measure in California, which has probably not gotten much publicity in Massachusetts, but as I understand it, it would take place on the same day as the presidential election, and it would require the state agencies, which of course probably have as many people as Massachusetts or more, to pay no more for prescription drugs than the Department of Veterans Affairs, which I guess has among the lowest. This is something that the state unions are lobbying for heavily, as I understand. Someone from California was saying to me that unlike Las Vegas, what happens in California doesn't stay in California. Is this something that concerns you?
Yeah, I think this would be devastating. There's a misguided view that, so we make very expensive drugs. We realize that, many people, many countries around the world can't afford it. We give it free. Now, the fact that we give it free in those places doesn't mean we can give it free everywhere. So the fact that we have a lower price for the veterans, because that's a part of our community that we feel deserves a break and deserves additional support, and we say, okay, well, if you can give it to the veterans free, then of course you must be able to give it to everybody else for that low price, is absurd. And I think that, and it not staying in California, no, there's nothing of that type which doesn't instantly become national. So, again, as a consumer of healthcare, think really carefully. My advice to everybody is be careful. The system may not be perfect, but it's working in a lot of ways. You can do a lot of harm.
Hey, I want to open it up for questions. Kevin.
David, I applaud you for coming out. This is a friendly crowd, obviously. But no, I think we need more of what you're doing. And you took my question away about, part of that problem is your problem in saying costs $2 billion. And so now the legislature will show us, So, that's something you have to kind of work at. I guess my question is, when I went to Bob's legislative forum, there was a patient advocacy group. There were legislators, there were insurers, by my count, it was 4-1 against you. And you're up against that. So I guess the simple question is, what's your plan? I hear the word conversation. Well, that's bullshit. I mean, come on. You guys got to go on the offense, and Bio has got to stop saying no, because guess what? This avalanche is coming, and so I think you guys have got to come together and say, what is our plan? How are we going to do a better job of articulating to the people out there that aren't on your side, or we're going to be in real problems?
So it's a great question.
You can keep the microphone.
Yeah, it's good. So first of all, it's interesting. The patient groups are not universally against us. Actually, if we went around, I would, and I couldn't count them all up, but they're more with us than against us because they see us as part of the solution. Bob's a CF dad. The solution for his son is not in more hospitals. And CF is just getting to some of those breakthrough points. So the patient groups aren't against it. Let's take the insurers. They create a system. So first of all, if you take the premiums that they take in and the amount they pay out, that difference is 6%. You know, so 6%. I'm going to misquote my number. The point is, in that differential is an enormous amount of money that would cover more than cover the pharmaceutical budget. That's number one. Number two, there's an active choice that says, I'm going to make you pay less for your hospitalizations and more for your pharmaceutical drugs. That's an active choice. I'm going to make you step through inferior treatments to get to the better treatments because it's cheaper for me. In a transparency world, they're pointing out our list price when they know better than anybody else what the net price is, because their world is totally driven on discounts. We priced our MS drug at the lowest price of any of the drugs in that overall group of possible treatments, all of them. We got 0 credit. The reason was there was no incentive for that part to use our drug because they, at the lowest price, they didn't get a discount. They wanted a higher price and a discount. So your point is going on the attack? Absolutely. Now, at the end of the day, we got to stop attacking and come together and say, we need to make this system work. We need, all of us are stakeholders. I'm standing up here as a patient. I happen to work for the industry. I'm a patient. My family are patients. So, and we all know what it feels like to sit in that chair or have somebody we love sit in that chair. So again, I don't disagree with you, and it worries me about the rhetoric, and we're in a political season and things are heightened. We got to get through this moment, let things quiet down, but we got to get serious about, you know, some of these solutions, and we have a role to play. They have a role to play.
Other questions?
So, David, am I hearing that you feel like the message is something along the lines of the insurers are pushing the ball down the road as far as they can with the idea that they might offload the patients before they have that acute event that's really expensive, and they aren't willing to make the maybe more chronic treatment decisions that a lot of these compounds would be providing to patients?
So let me put it in a different way. So I'm a physician.
Yeah.
I'm a pulmonologist. In the first half of my career, I did bronchoscopies. So that's a procedure. We get paid more to do that procedure than I do to see a patient in clinic. In a fee-for-service world, I guarantee you, I do more bronchoscopies than I do in a capitated world. And I guarantee you that at the end of the day, when I go home, I look in the mirror and I say, I gave good care to every one of my patients in both of those worlds. In one I did more, in the other one I did less. All justified, not doing or doing. So my point is that the insurers are not looking in the mirror and saying, they're good people. They're not trying to say, I'm trying to destroy the health of the patients who ultimately they're trying to serve as well, but they are following their incentives. And as long as their incentives say, it's better for us if you spend longer on this less expensive drug, we're going to create a system that favors that. Even if there's a better drug that's more expensive. So I think, again, we need to go back and look at the incentives for every part of this system. All of us in the system have incentives. Let's re-examine those incentives and say, are they aligned most closely with the person who most needs it, which is the patient?
Hi, Colin White, Galbraith White. Thank you. Excellent session. You mentioned ISA as an organization, Boston-based, which everyone gets very excited about. But this is not a very new phenomenon. We've had health technology appraisal around the world. Australia, 1986. And if you want Australia prices, then have their biotech industry that goes with it. But the point is that this is an evolving thing, and we've had, PBS 1986, SBU in Sweden 87, NICE 2000, ICVIG 2004, CESP in France 2008, AMNOG Law in Germany 2011, Sloan Kettering Drug Abacus, ASCO Framework ISA last year. This is a very evolving process, and what we've learned over these years is that nobody actually has the ultimate version of how to assess value. What we know is there's no societal recognition of value in those processes. There is no understanding of burden of disease within the QALY calculation. And because it's life years driven, it's time driven, so therefore discriminates against patients with less time to live. So what we know about health technology appraisal is that it's a very, very long way from being perfect. So I think one of the things that the reason all these exist is because one of the things that's missing is what's our contribution to what is a better way of assessing value. So if I think there's one vacuum we do need to fill, it's having a bigger voice in what is value. And I think that's one of the things we should do more of, rather than just be beaten to death by these other organizations.
So that wasn't a question, but it was a great comment, and thank you for that. And I think you described it perfectly, right, which is to say tough problems take time. You keep working at them, right? You don't give up just because you didn't get it right on the first round. One of the things I appreciate most about the NICE process is the Citizens Council. You know, they have a Citizens Council which weighs in a non-HTA, non-medical, just they're the societal voice. And so, you know, all of these different elements, you know, we will continue to get better at this. It will never be easy for the reasons you said.
Anyone else? You know, we didn't talk about generics, so let me just ask one last question about, as biosimilars begin to come onto the market, what impact will that have on the price of biologic drugs?
Yeah, so it's a great one to end on because I think it's something we forget about. 88% of pharmaceutical use today in the United States is generic. They started out as branded drugs. They are now out there pennies a day in the small molecule world. Now, biosimilars, everybody says, well, biosimilars are going to be different. And if we look at the first examples of biosimilars, they are, yes, they're only 15, 20% less than the innovator drug. But it's early. And I think what we're going to see over time is they will continue to come down. They will never equal generics, the small molecule drugs, because of the work that needs to go in and the cost of manufacturing a biologic, as opposed to biosimilar by definition says I need to do more work to show that I am safe and effective. I can't just copy it and say I'm going to now use all of my innovators' information and it's safe and effective. I have to do work. I have to prove that I am similar enough and then do the missing work. And I will charge you more for that. So biosimilars will not drop the way, but they will drop. And they will drop driven not by legislation, but by market forces. And if legislation gets in the way, again, the system is going to break. It'll be distorted and we'll not get a good outcome.
Well, thanks, David. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Bob. And thank you all for coming.